Verse 638. The 5 Dharmas, the Svabhavas, the 8 Vijnanas, and the twofold egolessness, they are all embraced in the Mahayana. So we've got 4 rather technical categories here. And if you've been with me for many of these videos, then hopefully you won't find them particularly off-putting, especially as you'll know from experience that I'm going to show how these categories as they're presented here are relevant to our immediate experiencing. Then again, you might be somebody who's doing some research, perhaps on the Svabhavas, and you found yourself at this video. And in fact, you could do quite a lot of research on these categories, the 5 Dharmas, the Svabhavas, and so on. And you could even write academic papers on it. There's quite a lot here to get your head around. It's quite a trap. It's all quite exotic and fascinating when you look into these things. So we have to be very wary of that trap of getting stuck in what we might call philosophizing. We need to get our head around these terms to some extent, but really that activity should be quite limited. What we really need to be doing is getting around our head. And that's what these categories are actually about. They're about getting us around our head. They're about pointing us to something beyond the conceptualizing mind. Unfortunately, stuff like this is fodder for the conceptualizing mind. The conceptualizing mind loves this sort of stuff. In a way, I'm setting myself up for philosophical argument. I'm not the least bit interested in philosophical argument or getting into that territory. My concern is with unlocking the full potential of this text and texts like it. And this means seeing how they apply to our immediate situation. I'll say more about this in a minute, but let's just look at this then. Each of these categories, as I said, if you've followed most of these videos, you'll be familiar with them. And in fact, I've devoted videos exclusively to these categories. The 5 Dharmas is video 204, the 5 factors of enlightenment practice. Video 30 is entitled Svabhava. Video 10 is Vijnana. I don't seem to have a video on the twofold egolessness, but it's one of these themes, like the others, that have cropped up regularly in these videos. This verse is like a punctuation mark. It's like a kind of summing up. And so what I'm going to do is look at the main point of each of these categories. My approach to them in the past has been to regard these categories as descriptions of enlightenment practice. So for example, the 5 Dharmas culminate in suchness, tathata. This is the starting point actually of enlightenment practice. It's realization of the true nature of the awareness that is hearing this. From the perspective of suchness, we see things as they really are. And this is perfect knowledge. The third Svabhava, the other two Svabhavas, represent the dynamic of delusion. But the third Svabhava, Panishpana, is perfect knowledge. So from suchness, we see things as they really are. The third category, the Vijnanas, again culminates in chitta, or what we might call mind only. And this is what we arrive at when we no longer subscribe to the world of the senses. And this includes the world of our thoughts. You might wonder if mind only is the same as suchness. Well, essentially, yes, it is. But it's how we arrive at suchness. And this is to do with our knowledge, our perfect knowledge of the nature of the sensory world. Mind only is our response to the sensory world, to everything that wants to draw the attention towards it. The senses is about, sense perception is about directing the attention to something in the sensory field. But when we're practicing, we appreciate what's going on, and we have the option of not letting the attention be diverted to the sensory field, but to abide in its own nature. This is mind only. So this is the practice. We begin with suchness, the realization of suchness, the realization of the true nature of the awareness that is hearing this. We apply that from this perspective. Our understanding of the world is arighted. It's topsy-turvy usually, it's upside down, our understanding. And now in the world of the senses, we're practicing. We're no longer letting the attention be on automatic, because the attention is automatically drawn to so-called sensory experiences. As enlightenment practitioners, though, we become aware of this. And in the realization of the last category of the twofold egolessnesses, this is reinforcing our practice, which consists of undermining the attention's habitual behavior. The twofold egolessness is saying there's nothing out there worth putting the attention onto. There's nothing real about it. And it's also saying there's nothing real here. Because I mentioned the senses. This is what the attention is drawn to. But really, what motivates, what drives the attention to focus on certain things is our own feelings, our own moods, our own psychology. We can be free from this. And this is a momentous thing. It's stupendous, it's a huge thing. And a little while back, I rather tentatively grasped the possibility that we can be free. I say tentatively because I I don't want this just to be my idea. But it seems to me that this is possibly the case. That we can be free. Free of our own psychology. Free from all limitations of understanding. And this is the full implication of the Zen teachings. That no matter what is going on, we can be happy. And this is a big thing. And I mentioned a short while back how it seemed to me that the universe was pointing me in the direction of a particular Greek sage known as Epictetus, who taught this very thing. And so I did some further research on Epictetus. I was very enthusiastic about this, and I still am after doing the research. Epictetus he was born about 50 AD, and you can purchase a little book it's called Enchiridion, which just means manual. It's a manual in Greek. This edition is published by Dover Books. It's quite a nice little edition, but it's just a reprint, and it doesn't say, rather naughtily, it doesn't say when the original edition was. It's a translation from the Greek, and I'm sure it's been translated into very good English, but it's not particularly readable. Still, it's worth having a look at. It's a very slim volume. The manual is a collection of aphorisms of Epictetus. But there is another version of this, which I do recommend. It's called A Manual for Living, and it's a new interpretation by Sharon Lebel. What Sharon Lebel has done is she's paraphrased most of the aphorisms in this manual into modern English, and I've got a few quibbles with it, but it wouldn't stop me from heartily recommending it. And it's a little book which I think most teenagers would find accessible. So this is great. We can get the wisdom of Zen Buddhism and Stoicism in a very accessible manner here. Now there are a few endorsements of the book, of Sharon Lebel's book, which I think I'll mention. There's one here by Jacob Needleman, Professor of Philosophy, San Francisco State University, and author of The Heart of Philosophy. I don't know if it's an endorsement of this particular book, but it's certainly an endorsement of Epictetus. The message of Epictetus is as vital today as it ever was. No other philosopher shows more clearly what it really means to cultivate an active mind in the face of everything that life throws at us. This alone is, for many of us, the first practical step along the path of inner freedom. And there's another endorsement from Willis Barnstone, Distinguished Professor of Comparative Literature, Indiana University. And he says, in her ingenious rendering, Sharon Lebel has freshly captured the perennial East-West wisdom of Epictetus. In plain, lucid speech, this little book provides a contemporary manual for goodness, composed happiness, moral courage, and inner serenity. And finally, there is an endorsement from Houston Smith, author of The World's Religions and Forgotten Truth. And this is particularly relevant. This slim classic, the West's counterpart to Buddhism's beloved Dhammapada, contains more practical wisdom than an entire shelf of today's self-help books. If it seems low-key, that is because Epictetus's grip on the truth is so firm that he doesn't need to raise his voice. Sharon Lebel's deft rendering of the text makes it readily accessible to the contemporary reader. So, interesting comparisons here. The Dhammapada is a very old Buddhist text, very similar in tone to Epictetus's manual, his Enchiridion. The thing is, the Dhammapada teaches nirvana. Does Epictetus teach nirvana? Well, the fact that the Buddhists and the Indians put a name to this and call it nirvana, we shouldn't be put off by this. We shouldn't be put off by what's sometimes referred to as the mysticism of Indian thought. There's nothing mystical about nirvana. The Stoics taught peace of mind, and this is nirvana. I think the Stoics called it apatheia, which obviously is where we get apathy from, but there's certainly nothing apathetic about the Stoic teachings or about Epictetus's teachings. You are actively engaged with life. This is a manual for living after all. So here we have it. A manual for living. I've had an underlying concern in doing these videos at the apparent esoteric nature of them. I know that most people aren't going to be able to connect with this, even though it's so vitally relevant and significant. It's all about being alive and optimizing that. But how can this be communicated? And it seems a bit strange to have to go back almost 2,000 years to a Stoic sage. But this is what many of the ancients were concerned with. They were concerned with the greatest happiness, how to make the most out of life. And I sometimes feel perhaps I'm not the best advert for this, but I'm simply the messenger. I'm bringing this treasure to the surface. I invite you to open the treasure chest for yourself. That's all I'm doing. I'm not trying to sell anything. I'm not using myself as an example. Although I have to say, if you think about the effort I've made in presenting these teachings, you'll get some idea of their importance to me. So the language of Buddhism is different from the language of Epictetus and of Sharon Lebel. But I think this main difference in language can be accounted for by the appreciation, the unbounded appreciation of the Indian mentality. They talk about nirvana, enlightenment, Buddhahood. And in that appreciation, sometimes it seems that these possibilities become very remote. But they're not. It is all within our very own potential for realizing. Epictetus taught that if we have no control over something, then let it go. There's no point in calling it good or bad. Good or bad only arises in our response to it. And it's bad, our response is bad, if we allow something which we've got no control over, to affect us, to affect our mood in a negative way. So the practice is to realize that if we have no control over something, then we are free to be happy. Now, of course, in practice, this is a challenge, but this is the challenge of living. And it's possibly more complicated in modern times because we've got the illusion of control, of more and more control that technology gives us. So that's something to consider. But right now, for the most part, we focus on our day-to-day living, on the things that irritate us. If you're driving along the road and somebody pulls out in front of you, are you going to enter into a rage? This is something you had no control over. Or if your partner has tidied up and you can't find something that you were sure you'd put down there just a few days ago, are you going to get very irritated? So it's the small things we need to be looking at. Never mind the big issues. It's the small things that fuel our moods. Are we going to let our moods master us? Or do we become master of our moods? This is the art of living.